The weight of a name Nathaniel Hartwell was not a man who arrived anywhere quietly. Even on the most ordinary mornings, his presence preceded him, a shift in the air, a straightening of spines, a sudden awareness that power had entered the room. But on the cold Tuesday morning that would change his life forever, he stepped out of his black car in front of the Bridgemont courthouse and felt, for the first time in 20 years, the unmistakable sensation of losing control. The media had gathered in force. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Reporters shouted questions into the sharp winter air, their voices blurring together into a single, relentless noise. Nathaniel moved through it all without flinching, his jaw set, his dark overcoat perfectly pressed, his attorney Priscilla Vane walking briskly at his side. To anyone watching, he looked every inch the man his reputation described, unshakable, decisive, and absolutely certain of himself. But Nathaniel was none of those things that morning. He had built his fortune from the ground up, taking his father's modest real estate holdings and transforming them into a billion-dollar empire that stretched across media, technology investment, and luxury development. The Hartwell name was a brand, a promise, and a shield. For 30 years, it had kept him insulated from the kind of trouble that swallowed lesser men. He had survived hostile corporate takeovers, public scandals involving rival businessmen, and 2 near-catastrophic financial crashes that had brought other powerful families to their knees. He had always come out standing. The case that brought him to this courthouse today was different. Vivian Lorne had been charged with financial fraud, specifically, with allegedly manipulating investor funds tied to a media development project that Nathaniel himself had overseen and championed. The press had assumed the worst within hours. By the following morning, the story of a supposed secret affair between Vivian and Nathaniel had exploded across every tabloid and gossip channel in the country. Photographs of the two of them at formal business dinners were pulled from old archives and repackaged as intimate evidence of something the public had already decided it understood. The headlines were cruel and completely certain: billionaire's secret lover at center of fraud scandal. Society had tried and convicted them both before a single word of testimony had been given. What the public did not know, what almost no living person in the world knew, was the truth of who Vivian Lorne actually was to Nathaniel Hartwell. Inside the marble courthouse, the energy was electric and close. The public gallery was packed with journalists, sharp-eyed observers, and a number of well-dressed figures whose careful expressions made clear they had significant personal stakes in whatever happened today. Judge Raymond Osei entered precisely on time, his bearing unhurried and deliberate, settling into his seat with the calm authority of a man who had watched every shade of human drama play out before him and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. Vivian sat at the defendant's table. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost disciplined: strong cheekbones, dark eyes, the kind of absolute stillness that most people mistook for coldness. She wore a simple navy dress and no jewelry. She had not looked at Nathaniel since he walked into the building, though her hands, folded neatly on the table in front of her, gripped each other just a fraction too tightly for the composure she was performing to be entirely real. Nathaniel took his seat in the row directly behind her, within the observer section. Priscilla leaned close and whispered something sharp and efficient about the opening motion, but he heard very little of it. His attention kept drifting toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. He had told Beatrice not to come. He had been firm about it. He had offered her every logical, practical reason why her presence was unnecessary: her health, the final stretch of her pregnancy, the carefully constructed narrative Priscilla had spent weeks building. Beatrice had listened to all of it in that particular quiet way she had, her eyes steady and calm, and had said very little in response. That should have told him something. At 9:47 in the morning, those double doors swung open. The entire courtroom seemed to pause. Nathaniel turned, as nearly everyone else did, and felt something shift in the room and in his chest simultaneously. Beatrice Hartwell walked through those doors wearing a long camel-colored coat that fell open at the front, revealing the full, unmistakable curve of her pregnancy, 7 months along, round and undeniable, and somehow making her look not fragile, but formidable. She moved with deliberate, measured steps, her dark hair pinned back cleanly, her eyes moving across the room with the calm of someone who had already decided everything that needed to be decided before they arrived. She was 38 years old, and she was, without any question at all, the most composed person in that entire marble building. The murmur that moved through the gallery was immediate and impossible to suppress. Journalists who had been half asleep straightened and leaned forward. Cameras that had been lowered came back up. Judge Osei raised one hand and the room quieted, but the tension did not leave, it gathered itself, pulling tighter, coiling into every corner and crevice of that grand space. Beatrice walked down the center aisle. She did not look at the press. She did not look at Priscilla, whose professional mask had cracked slightly into an expression caught somewhere between alarm and confusion. She looked at Nathaniel for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand with complete clarity that she was not here by accident, she was not here to be managed, and she was not going to be stopped, and then she continued forward, moving toward the front of the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the silent courtroom without effort or strain, "my name is Beatrice Hartwell. I am the wife of Nathaniel Hartwell, and I am formally requesting permission to address this court. I have information that is directly and materially relevant to this case. Information that, if not presented today, will result in a serious and irreversible miscarriage of justice." Judge Osei studied her for a long, measured moment over the tops of his glasses. Priscilla was already rising from her seat, beginning an objection that sounded more uncertain than she intended. Vivian, at the defendant's table, had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that is not calm at all, but its opposite. And Nathaniel Hartwell, the man who had never lost anything in his life, sat in that polished marble room and felt something break open quietly inside his chest. Not from fear. Not from anger. But from the sudden, staggering understanding that his wife had known the truth, possibly all of it, for a very long time, and had been quietly, patiently waiting for exactly this moment to speak it out loud. What the marble walls heard. Judge Raymond Osei was not a man who made decisions in haste. He had presided over this courthouse for 19 years, and in those 19 years he had seen mothers weep on witness stands, watched powerful men dissolve under the weight of their own lies, and listened to testimony that had rearranged his understanding of human nature more times than he could count. He had learned, through all of it, to read a room, and what he read in that courtroom at 9:48 in the morning told him clearly that whatever this woman was carrying inside that folder pressed against her chest, it mattered in a way that his courtroom could not afford to ignore. He raised one hand toward Priscilla Vane, whose objection died mid-sentence. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice measured and unhurried, "I am going to allow you 5 minutes to present your grounds. If what you bring before this court is substantive and directly relevant to the matter at hand, we will proceed accordingly. If it is not, I will ask you to be seated and we will continue." He paused and looked at her with the quiet authority of a man who respected courage enough to meet it fairly. "You may approach." Beatrice walked forward. The sound of her footsteps on the marble floor was the only sound in the entire building. Every journalist in the gallery had stopped writing. Priscilla stood with one hand braced against the table, watching with an expression that had moved past alarm and was now settling into something closer to dread. Nathaniel had not moved. He sat with both hands flat on his knees, his face composed in the way a face is composed when the person behind it is working very hard to hold something together that wants very much to come apart. Vivian had turned her head slightly. Just enough to watch from the edge of her vision without fully turning around. Her knuckles against the table in front of her were white. Beatrice placed her folder on the surface before the judge and opened it with steady hands. Inside were documents arranged in careful, clean order, printed pages, photographs of digital records, and a series of bank transfer receipts that had been highlighted in soft yellow. She had organized it with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had not done this quickly, or carelessly, or out of panic. She had done it the way someone does something when they have been building toward it for a very long time. "Your Honor," she began, "I want to address 2 separate truths today. The first speaks to the nature of the relationship between my husband and Miss Vivian Lorne. The second speaks to the actual source of the fraud at the center of this case." She lifted her eyes to the judge. "I ask that you allow me to present both, because neither one makes full sense without the other. Judge Osei nodded once. Beatrice turned to face the courtroom. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She simply spoke, clearly and without hesitation, the way someone speaks when they no longer have any use for pretending. Vivian Lorne is not Nathaniel Hartwell's mistress, she said. She is his half-sister. The reaction in that courtroom was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was a sudden, collective silence so deep and so complete that the hum of the overhead lighting became audible. And then, from within that silence, came the sound of chairs shifting, the sharp intake of a dozen breaths, and the low, electric murmur of people processing something that had completely overturned the story they believed they understood. Priscilla sat down. Beatrice continued. She explained what she had uncovered over 4 months of private, careful investigation, carried out quietly while Nathaniel attended board meetings and fundraising dinners and press engagements, while she attended prenatal appointments alone and told no one what she was doing with the hours she had left over. She had found records. Financial transfers from the estate of the late Ernest Hartwell, Nathaniel's father, dating back 32 years, made to a woman named Celeste Lorne, a former employee of the Hartwell family's original real estate firm. She had found a birth certificate. She had found correspondence between Celeste and Ernest that was tender, genuine, and ultimately heartbreaking, a relationship that had been sealed away under legal agreements and non-disclosure clauses before Vivian had even taken her first steps. Ernest Hartwell had provided for Celeste and her daughter financially throughout his life. He had never acknowledged them publicly. He had never told Nathaniel. And when he died, the structured payments stopped and the paper trail was buried beneath 2 decades of corporate reorganizations, making it almost impossible to find, unless you were a woman with 4 months of sleepless nights, an exceptional attention to detail, and a very specific reason to look. At the defendant's table, Vivian had stopped pretending to be still. Her shoulders came forward first. Then her head dropped slightly. And then, without any warning, without any of the careful composure she had been holding like armor from the moment she walked into that building, Vivian Lorne put her face in her hands and wept. Not the restrained, dignified crying that courtrooms sometimes witnessed. Real crying, broken and unguarded and full of something that had been locked up for a very long time. Nathaniel made a sound. Just a brief one, low in his throat, quickly controlled. But in the silence of that room, it was audible. He was looking at the back of Vivian's head with an expression that had nothing in it of the polished, composed public figure he had walked in as that morning. His eyes were full and open and completely undefended, and anyone watching him in that moment understood without needing to be told that he had not known. That whatever he had suspected, or wondered, or half allowed himself to consider over the years, he had not known this with any certainty. And that it was landing in him now the way a truth lands when it arrives too late and all at once, when there is no longer any softness between you and the full weight of it. Judge Osei restored order with 2 firm strikes of his gavel. Priscilla was on her feet again, speaking rapidly, her professional instincts reasserting themselves even as the ground shifted beneath the case she had spent weeks preparing. The gallery buzzed. A junior attorney at the prosecution's table was leaning toward his colleague with urgent, whispered words. And Beatrice, standing at the front of that marble room with her folder of documents and her 7-month belly and her extraordinary, unshakable calm, turned her head and looked back across the crowded courtroom. She looked past the journalists. She looked past Priscilla. She looked past Nathaniel, whose eyes had found hers with a searching, unreadable expression that contained somewhere inside it both gratitude and grief. She looked directly at Oliver Marsh. Oliver was seated in the 3rd row from the front, dressed in a conservative charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly parted. He had the practiced stillness of a man who had spent 30 years making himself functionally invisible in rooms full of powerful people, anticipating needs, managing logistics, keeping secrets with the professional discretion of someone who understood that his usefulness depended entirely on his reliability. He had worked for Nathaniel for 28 years. He had access to everything. He knew everyone. And in the 2 seconds that Beatrice held his gaze, she watched something move behind his eyes, a flicker of calculation rapidly replaced by a smooth, unreadable blankness. She had seen it before. She had been watching for it. She turned back to Judge Osei. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still perfectly steady, "I told you there were 2 truths. The first was about family. The second is about fraud." She placed one final document on top of the folder before the judge. "And the person responsible for it is sitting in this courtroom right now. The woman who changed everything." The document Beatrice placed before Judge Osei was a single printed page. Clean, precise, and devastating in the way that only the simplest truths can be devastating, not complicated, not buried in legal language, but direct and completely clear. It was a series of internal digital communications, printed from an encrypted account that had been routed through 3 separate servers and ultimately traced back to a terminal registered to the administrative office of Hartwell Global Enterprises. The account belonged to no listed employee. The account belonged to no named contractor. But the device it had been accessed from, the IP address embedded in every transmission, the physical terminal logged in the building's own internal security records, all of it pointed to one place. One desk. One man. Oliver Marsh did not move immediately. That was the detail Beatrice remembered afterward, in the quiet of the hospital room weeks later, when Nathaniel asked her what the moment had felt like. She told him that Oliver's stillness in those first seconds was more frightening than anything else, because it was not the stillness of innocence. It was the stillness of someone rapidly calculating whether there was still a move available on the board. And in that brief window, she watched him decide there was not. He rose from his seat. He did it calmly, smoothly, with the unhurried confidence of a man who had spent 3 decades managing situations that others found unmanageable. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the slim leather portfolio from the seat beside him. And he began moving toward the aisle with the measured, unhurried steps of someone who had simply decided it was time to leave. He did not make it to the doors. 2 courthouse security officers moved into the aisle before he reached the end of the row, and the quiet, almost gentle firmness with which they stopped him was somehow more final than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Oliver stood between them for a moment, his portfolio still under one arm, his silver hair still perfectly parted, and looked back at the courtroom with an expression that had lost every last trace of its careful blankness. What remained underneath was something older and colder, not remorse, but the particular, exhausted look of a man who has been performing a version of himself for so long that being caught feels less like disaster and more like relief. Priscilla had abandoned any further attempt at objection. She stood at the defense table with both hands pressed flat against its surface, staring toward the back of the room with the stunned expression of someone who has just understood, all at once, that the case she had been building was constructed on top of a lie she had never been told. Judge Osei called a recess. In the 40 minutes that followed, the courtroom transformed. The prosecution team huddled in urgent conversation with 2 additional attorneys who arrived within 20 minutes carrying new documents. Priscilla disappeared into a private consultation room with Nathaniel and emerged looking 10 years older and considerably more human. Vivian sat in a side room with a glass of water she did not drink, her eyes dry now but remote, the eyes of someone who has received a piece of news so large that it has not yet fully arrived, and will not fully arrive for some time. When the session resumed, Judge Osei addressed the court with the precise, unhurried authority that had characterized every moment of his involvement that morning. He announced a formal suspension of the current charges against Vivian Lorne pending a full reinvestigation into the financial records presented by Beatrice Hartwell. He directed that Oliver Marsh be detained for questioning in relation to the material evidence submitted. He commended, in the careful and measured language of a man who chose his words with great precision, the courage it required to bring forward information of this nature under the circumstances in which it had been brought. Vivian was released from the defendant's table. She stood for a moment in the center of the courtroom, not entirely sure where to go or what she was supposed to do with her hands or her face or the enormous, disorienting weight of the last 90 minutes. And then Beatrice, moving with that same unhurried, purposeful walk that had carried her through those courthouse doors that morning, crossed the floor toward her. They had never met. Not properly. Not honestly. They had existed in each other's awareness as shadows, the woman the press had decided was a threat, and the wife the press had decided was a victim, and neither of those descriptions had ever been true. Beatrice stopped in front of Vivian and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that held no triumph in it, no performance, nothing designed for the cameras that were very certainly still rolling somewhere in that gallery. She said, quietly and simply, "You deserve to know who you were. I'm sorry it took this long." Vivian pressed her lips together hard. She nodded once. She did not trust herself to speak, and Beatrice seemed to understand that completely, because she did not wait for a response. She simply placed one hand briefly on Vivian's arm, a gesture so brief and so human that several journalists in the gallery later struggled to describe it accurately, because it did not fit any of the stories they had already decided they were writing. Then Beatrice turned and found Nathaniel. He was standing apart from Priscilla, apart from the attorneys and the press and the noise, in a small clear space near the side wall of the courtroom. He was looking at her with an expression that she had seen on his face only a handful of times in their 11 years of marriage, completely unguarded, completely stripped of the careful, constructed composure that he wore through the world like a second suit. His eyes were bright and full in a way that would have surprised anyone who only knew him from boardrooms or headlines or carefully staged charity photographs. He was 51 years old, one of the most powerful men in the country, and he looked, in that moment, like someone who had just been handed back something he had not realized he had already lost. Beatrice walked to him. She did not say anything immediately. She stood in front of him, one hand resting instinctively on the curve of her belly, and looked up at him with the steady, unflinching directness that had been the quality he fell in love with 20 years ago and had somehow, in the relentless machinery of their shared life, allowed himself to take for granted. "You kept her secret," Beatrice said. "Even from yourself." She paused. "That ends now." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. His jaw was tight, working against something that wanted very much to surface. He put one hand over hers where it rested against her stomach, covering it completely, and he exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry out of him something he had been holding for years longer than he could accurately name. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "I wasn't even certain. Not fully." "I know," she said. "That's why I found out myself." The gallery was still buzzing around them, reporters talking rapidly into phones, attorneys exchanging rapid urgent words, courthouse staff moving with purpose through the aisles. Oliver Marsh had been quietly and firmly removed from the building. Vivian stood near the window at the far end of the room, looking out at the cold winter street below with the particular stillness of someone beginning, very slowly, to understand that their life has just changed shape in a way it will never change back from. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening in the Hartwell Private Medical Suite on the 14th floor of St. Bridgemont Hospital, Beatrice gave birth to a boy. 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with his father's dark eyes and a grip on Nathaniel's finger that made the man laugh in a broken, helpless, entirely genuine way that his personal assistant and his board of directors and his media consultants would not have recognized at all. They named him Ernest. Not for legacy. Not for performance. For honesty, the quiet, belated honesty of a family that had finally stopped burying what it needed to say out loud. On the windowsill of the room the following morning, a small arrangement of white flowers arrived with no card. Just a single folded note tucked between the stems, 3 words written in careful handwriting that Beatrice recognized immediately and pressed to her chest for a long, quiet moment before she passed it to Nathaniel. He unfolded it. He read it. He sat with it in silence for a while, looking out the window at the pale winter sky, his newborn son asleep against his chest, his wife resting beside him with her eyes half closed and her hand in his. The note said only, "Thank you both." And in that quiet room, on that ordinary Thursday morning, with no cameras and no courtrooms and no marble floors and no performance of any kind required of anyone, the Hartwell family, all of it, every complicated and long buried and newly discovered piece of it, began, gently and imperfectly and with great care, to heal.